The ego takes what it learns from your experiences and begins to write a story and begins to inform you of who you are. And those two ways are defense mechanisms and protective identities. So let me ask you now, has some past trauma, injury, abuse, loss, misfortune led to a chapter in your story written by your ego where you are now weak, afraid, vulnerable, out of control? You're some kind of freak? Ask yourself that now or after the episode. Has your ego written a chapter of your story now where because of something that happened to you out of your control, or perhaps you were responsible, but you suffer the consequences, trauma, injury, loss, abuse, misfortune, something. Has something happened to you where now you are starting to believe that as a result, you are weak, you're afraid, the world is a big, bad, mean, scary place that judges you and inflicts pain on you. You're vulnerable to it now. You're some kind of freak. You're different. You've been screwed over. It's worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about. It took me many years to get there, but I did have to ask those questions of myself. And I would also ask you too, as a result, are you now striving to take back control in your life in ways that are unhealthy? And that was the case for me. You saw it with, as I said, my overeating, drugs, and alcohol. It's not uncommon. It's not uncommon for us to lose control in one way through a traumatic experience, to put that in the back of our mind somewhere and now go forward saying, look, I got to take control of something because I lost control back there and I did not like that. So, let me shove bagels into my face and smoke 3 joints. At least now I'm feeling all right. So ask yourself, are you striving to take back control in ways that are unhealthy? Let's dig into a few of those. I have a list here of 11 defense mechanisms and 10 protective identities that our ego creates. And those come in the fallout or in the days, weeks, years, months after a traumatic experience or failure or loss. 11 defense mechanisms and 10 protective identities. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I am going to make that list available to you. There'll be a link in the show notes. So, hopefully if what I'm about to talk to isn't resonating, you can go through and say, hey, here's one that he didn't mention that I see on this list that I can now start to think about. And again, I'm not a therapist. This is not psychology. This is simply me trying to communicate some information to you. So we understand now how our ego is writing the story of our life. And if you're like me and you suffered some form of trauma or a painful experience of any kind, the ego is now going to add that into the story. It says, hey, this world is scary. It can hurt us. I had my control taken away from me. We've got to take back control somehow. A big part of the way that we do this sometimes is defense mechanisms, right? And as I said, I've got a list of defense mechanisms you can check out. I want to touch on just 2 quickly. For me, a huge one was projection. I assumed that, because I felt ashamed about myself, because I felt insecure, let's say, about my body, I developed body dysmorphia. I started to feel like an alien in my own being. And I had a lot of regret and a lot of wishing I looked a certain way, wishing I was a certain way. Well, I assume then that all of that must exist in the outside world too. I mean, after all, that's where the problem came from. So I assume that people looked down upon me, that people judged me, that people didn't want to be around me, didn't take me seriously, didn't like me, I couldn't fit in. And there's always going to be a certain percentage of that in life. But looking back now with a certain amount of rational hindsight, I could say, well, a lot of that I made up, a lot of opportunities I let pass by, a lot of experiences I didn't take. I didn't put myself fully out into the world because I assumed that the world was a place that wouldn't receive me. When I think if I could say anything now, it's that the grand sort of wonder of the world is that the world will receive you when you're putting yourself out there authentically. And as you grow to be older and stronger, you'll realize that what doesn't serve you or accept you really doesn't matter. It's of no consequence to you. So it's easy for me to say that now, but again, that came from that ego created defense mechanism that said, hey, the world's big and mean, and every single person around is probably pretty mean too. Now, another big one was, and this is huge, I think, for a lot of people, they call it, the list that I saw, they call it displacement. And that's basically taking that emotional pain that you feel because of the incident, because of that, what your ego has now told you about what happened, and putting it into other things, like channeling it into strange places. And I think, if emotional outbursts or mood swings, poor emotional control is part of your problem, Think about displacement now. Has something happened to you that really bugged you, really hurt you, really bothered you? And now you're just going to take it out on the dog, or take it out on your partner, or take it out on someone's car, or take it out in road rage, whatever that may be. That pain, that emotion has to be processed. And again, I can't coach you all the way through it, but it's worth thinking about this idea of displacement. I know I did this. I remember one time I don't know what the hell I was thinking. This was really before working online side hustles were really a thing. And I put my credit card number online thinking there was some course or some job opportunity I was going to get. And it later was found out to be a scam. And it's not the end of the world. You could cancel the credit card. You could do something. It wasn't worth doing what I did, which was two-hand fisting a gigantic hole in my drywall, 3 or 4 feet or 5 feet high. It wasn't about the credit card, was it? It was that old traumatic experience coming back to haunt me. Where I said, "Oh my God, I can't believe I screwed something up," and that triggered that response to pound a hole in the wall. A great example of displacement. So it's worth asking yourself, are there defense mechanisms that I'm putting up to reassert control in my life in weird ways? It's very easy to say, well, I don't know, the world has hurt me, so now I'm going to just assume everything about the world, right? That's projection. Again, talking about displacement. I had no control over my emotion. I had no control over what happened to me back as a kid. The best I can do is bash a hole in the wall and maybe feel a little bit better. So ask yourself, what defense mechanisms are you doing? And definitely check out the list that I'll link to in the show notes. Now, second to defense mechanisms is this idea of forming a protective identity. And the idea of a protective identity is that it doesn't allow you to fully, authentically portray yourself or bring yourself to the world. And that was a huge problem in my case. And it's something I'm still working on. Because of shame or guilt or fear, I became, well, I'll give you a couple, a people pleaser. And that's still something I struggle with today. That's right, putting the needs and the feelings of other people before your own. How about being a joker or a clown, right? Always with a joke, always with a quip, never wanting to get into the real nitty gritty, never wanting to connect with people, hoping that if you can just make people laugh, they won't think too much more about you. Another big one, possibly why you're here, this idea of becoming a perfectionist or an overachiever. That is a protective identity that your ego is creating for you. In the face of perhaps a traumatic experience or whatever reason, that idea of perfectionism is like, well, I've lost control in this aspect of my life. Something happened to me where I was deeply, deeply pained and injured. I now know that I need to take control of every single thing in front of me, and I need to do it the best I possibly can. And we all know that's impossible. But when you start to think of these defense mechanisms and these protective identities as ways in which we look to take control of our life, take control of our experience in ways that are extreme, ways that are impossible. Another one was withdrawing completely socially, right? Being a recluse. A lot of it was tied to that fear of the outside world, fear of being judged, fear of having to go through the steps that any normal human being in the human race would go through. And possibly being judged, possibly being critiqued, possibly having to be vulnerable and learn something. Well, all of that sounds crazy. All of that sounds like out of my control. At least I can control that I just stay home. So check those lists and ask yourself, what defense mechanisms have I put up for myself, and what protective identity am I living? What has been written into my story? This character that I've become in my own story, what's he all about? And once you've done that, we can start to talk now about what the hell we can do about it.